Let's start with this business about real philosophy.
Yes, and professional philosophy versus professional academic philosophy.
Yes.
Well, okay, let me just briefly present the way I had set it up. And so
Yeah.
I'm thinking of professional academic philosophy in social institutional terms, as, practices of philosophy driven by neoliberal norms, primarily, especially since the Second World War, um, dominated by post-classical analytic philosophy, dominated by the drive to produce end publications, advance one's career, achieve certain levels of status in the profession, afflicted by a kind of dogmatic, or not even a kind of, a dogmatic scientism, and antipathetic to quote unquote continental philosophy, which really means, just about everything that analytic philosophers don't like. And so my worry is that the institutionalization of philosophy is the root of the problem. I mean, there are other problems having to do with the narrowness of topics, the inability of philosophers to expand and get a synoptic vision of sciences and literary practices and social sciences, natural sciences and social sciences and formal sciences. And so I was quite interested to see your, you mentioned that Buffalo might have a department of applied ontology, which would, I think, the way it sounded like an interdisciplinary department, would address the narrowness problem, but I don't think it would address or it seems to me it wouldn't address the social institutional problem of people still driven by grant, writing grant applications, satisfying requirements for, sustaining those grants, publishing, getting tenure, getting promotion. And so it would still have the problems attendant on those. And so I've thought of real philosophy as philosophy done for its own sake, with a synoptic vision of the human condition in a natural universe, taking into account, with a very broad generalist approach to these matters, but that it would have to be done outside the professional academy. That's
Yeah, so that's a lot of that which I can agree with, but it still doesn't change my eventual thesis, which is that there is a third way.
Okay, well, let's hear about the third then.
Okay, so first of all, one or 2 points on what you just said. The grantsmanship side of things is very recent. So I think I was one of the very first philosophers to get grant funding.
Yes, the very big ones too, I remember.
Yeah.
The European one, right?
Yeah. And when I started doing philosophy, which is 50 years ago now, and then for many decades thereafter, it was just unheard of that philosophers would even think about grants. So I agree with you that it's become a problem, but I think it's become a problem because philosophers have so little to work on that would make it reasonable that you pay them to do research.
Yes.
So I remember when they introduced this idea of computational humanities. That was a way of giving grant money to the philosophers or people in literary theory or history. And basically what it meant was that they built databases. And that was
it.
Computational humanities.
Yeah.
So the third way goes something like this. So ever since Aristotle, and then all the way through, including Adam Smith and then Wilhelm Wundt, who was a philosopher, philosophy has thrown off independent disciplines. It's been the motor for creating new sciences, because I think we both agree philosophers are people who go crazy in a certain direction and start saying things that no one else would consider. And some of those going crazy in a new direction scenarios led to entirely new scientific disciplines. And Wundt was a philosopher. His main research when he started doing psychology were published in a journal which he called Philosophical Studies. And when experimental psychology became a thing, there was a revolt among the philosophers because all these philosophy jobs in Germany were being given to people who were doing experimental psychology. There was a kind of trade union.
Yes. And he was branded a psychologist or something, wasn't he?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So, and I get similar attacks when I show that philosophical methods in ontology can be useful for doing real things in bioinformatics or in military data research and so forth, because they think that it's not a good thing when philosophy proves itself to be useful.
To be relevant, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that the best philosophy is precisely the philosophy which shows the way for doing something entirely new. And I think you probably agree with at least part of that.
I think I do, although I must also say that at least my conception of real philosophy, the one that, against the blog against professional philosophy
Yeah.
Promotes and so on, is quite political in the sense that it's supposed to be connected to a liberationist view of politics and not, so designing or helping people design weapons systems would not be part of the program.
Well, I don't do that. But I don't see any harm in using philosophical ideas to help people, for instance, build better defense systems or build better intelligence analysis systems, which is where most of the work I do with the military ends up. Currently, we have a project with the Five Eyes. I don't know if you know what that is. So they're the 5 English-speaking countries, and their intelligence communities have agreed officially that they will exchange data.
Right.
But they don't, the data that they have describes different worlds. So that the English ontology people within the intelligence community are all 4-dimensionalists. So, and they think that the way to describe data is not to describe people or places, it's to describe 4-dimensional time worms. And they have arguments why that's good, but to me, it's crazy.
Yeah.
So anyway, I think that what you're saying is compatible with what I'm wanting, but only along one channel. So you want philosophy to create a better liberal polity, which would be a kind of new science in a way. It would be a new way of doing ethics rooted in real world and real existence of real people.
Yes, and to design new social institutions.
Yeah.
So
I think you're going along the same path. I have no time for the usual way in which philosophers do ethics. It seems to me that it's going round in circles in a scholastic way, treating the same problems which have been treated of for decades, if not centuries, with slightly new nuances. I think the same thing holds of epistemology, actually.
Right.
So maybe we agree.
Yeah, I think we do. I mean, I think I think we do massively agree. Although just focusing on the differences, I think one of them might be that the real philosophy program we've described is inspired by Kant, whereas that seems not to have been anything that you were particularly interested in, or although I don't know that you've written against Kant anywhere. I'm not sure whether.
So it's a long story. I wrote this book on AI, which came out recently with a German.
Right. Yes, I'm just looking at it again this morning.
Yeah, a German co-author who's an old friend of mine. We met through our common contributions to the world of biomedical ontology.
Oh, okay. I wondered if he was related to Ludwig Landgrave.
Yeah, he's the grandson.
Okay. Yeah.
And he tells stories about how from the age of 12, he was subjected to tutorials on Ludwig Landgraber's knee. And so Ludwig Landgraber started the tutorials by saying, okay, we can't do anything until you have learned Aristotle in the original Greek. And Then they moved on to Kant.
Okay. Yeah.
And now, so Jobbs is an expert on very many things, and speaks very many languages and does all kinds of other things, which I can't believe, but it's a fact that he does them. And one of the things he's an expert on is Kant. And he's a German, which means that he is in favor of Kant. You can't do anything about it. But he's actually, if you talk to him, quite critical about most of what Kant has to say. So he thinks he's a great thinker, but most of what he has to say is wrong. But there are a few things which he thinks are very important.
Right.
So that's the closest I get to Kant.
Okay.
I had a bad experience just once in my time in Oxford. So in Oxford, we had a tutorial once a week. We had to write an essay, and then it would be torn to shreds
Right.
at the tutorial. And the only time I really suffered was the time I tried to write an essay on Kant. I think I just don't have that. I don't have
Who was your tutor?
Oh, a man called Hare, not the famous Hare, but
Not RM here. Yeah.
yeah. And I've forgotten his first name.
John?
Hmm?
There was somebody named John Hare.
No, that's not his
Okay.
name.
Yeah. Anyway,
It will
doesn't
come to me, but
Yeah.
he was a good tutor, so he did his part very well, but he wasn't a philosopher who was known in the wider world.
Right.
And in Oxford, for the first year or so, I was breathing the air of traditional analytic philosophy, although I was doing it primarily with Michael Dummett. And Michael Dummett is crazy, like you and I. And I went to lectures by Strawson and other people who were there, but I couldn't stand it. So I just went to the first lecture and then I stayed at home, because in Oxford, you didn't need to go to any lectures.
Yes.
The only philosophy lectures I attended attended religiously anyway, were by Dummett. Otherwise, I was studying a joint degree in mathematics and philosophy. And I had to attend the mathematics lectures. You couldn't skive off that.
Couldn't avoid those, yeah.
So were you at Oxford?
No, I did my PhD at Yale, and then but did a series of visiting fellowships at Cambridge. So I know the Cambridge department, or at least the Cambridge department, in a certain period quite well.
Yeah.
From the 90s to about 2007 or 8 or 9. So got
you know what the tutorial system amounts to. I don't think they have it anymore. I think it's probably
I mean they still have, at least as in the last time I was there, they still have supervisions and the same as tutorials, although they're always one-on-one rather than group.
Yeah. So in my day they were one-on-one. That was an amazing opportunity. So it teaches you to write to a deadline, which is a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
So shall we move on to the next item?
Sure. Yeah.
Do you have the list in front of you?
I've got the list.
I can get it, but
okay. So it starts limits of AI.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Yeah. Okay. And then
you have this idea about a certain kind of consciousness which is just inaccessible to reasoning machines. And I don't really understand the first part of your the thesis there. What is this special kind of consciousness?
Well, it's the kind of consciousness that only living organisms of a certain level of complexity can have. And so since these reasoning machines are not organisms and have not developed in the way that organisms do, then they don't have access to this consciousness. I mean, I think of consciousness, I was just looking at what you and Landgraber were saying about the continuity of mind and physical processes, which I think I agree with, at least on the holistic side. My way of formulating it is to say that minds, or that creatures like us, are form matter composites with physical structures and causal processes, and then formal features that arise over time at a certain level of complexity. And that, taken from the inside of the creature, is consciousness. So both the awareness of the world and then the awareness of
awareness. So I think we agree about that.
Yeah. Okay.
So do you agree that all of that is compatible with the view that everything in reality is physical?
Uh, well, I think everything in reality is physical and mental. Not always mental in the sense, but at least has the potentiality. So it's a sort of potentiality panpsychism. So the idea is that, it's a natural universe. Some of the systems, all of the systems, are either organic or mechanical. Some of the organic systems are minded, and the possibility of minded organic systems is built into the natural universe from the get-go. Can we get behind that? No, I think we just have to start with that as an hypothesis and then try to work out its implications.
Okay, so I share what you just said.
Mhm.
So Jobst has convinced me that what you just said is compatible with a view according to which everything is subject to the laws of physics. It's just that we don't know, and we probably can't know how it works physically, that we have
Yes,
consciousness.
yes. And the physical laws are much more complex than are ordinarily
Yeah,
they're understood to be.
yeah.
And the universe as a whole is not a closed system. It's got now I think it has, as it were, a creative urge from, in the direction of time and so on. So it's the universe as a whole, I think of as an organic system with mechanical subsystems.
But if it's made of physical entities, then that's perfectly compatible with what I'm saying.
Yes, yeah.
I don't.
Yeah,
so I'm very keen on the idea that there are many things that we just can't know.
Mm-hmm.
And we can't know how the universe began. We can't know whether it's going anywhere. We can't know whether we're free.
Right. Well, I think we can know whether we're free in the sense that if we define freedom as an ability to act act consistently with all the laws that there are, but not as necessitated by those laws. So in other words, in conformity with those laws, but not as necessitated by those laws. And to introduce new fine grain into the natural universe, that's what I think of as a capacity.
But it's still part of the natural universe.
It is, yeah, it's still part of the natural universe. Yeah, it's not coming from outside or from some noumenal realm.
Yeah, I think that you're sort of saying that we don't know.
Well, we
so we both know that we feel as if we are free.
Yes.
We feel as if we're not constrained.
Yes. Yeah.
That's for sure. We know a lot about consciousness because we have a lot of it all day long.
Yes.
And part of it is this feeling of being free.
Yes. And I think we can know what's manifestly real. What we can't know is, something that, as postulated, would lie behind what's manifestly real. So if there's as it were, a core or a noumenal essence or something to the universe, we should just forget it because we simply, the limitations on our awareness and knowledge are such that we'll never know it. And so we should start from the limitation or a kind of agnosticism.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, as you can imagine, having published this book, which is very unusual because it says there will never be a singularity, there will never be artificial general intelligence. We are rather on the hook for giving examples, specific examples of things which computers will never be able to do. Yes. And my latest example is you have two somewhat inebriated, bored teenage boys who are lying around on a sofa. And after an hour or so of just lying around and maybe telling a joke or two, one of them says, "Shall we play chess?" And the other one says, maybe after a while, "Yes, okay, we'll play chess." Now, that is a kind of spontaneous decision, which is brought into the world with no instructions, no causal reason for it to take place, but which is the sort of thing which happens to human beings all the time.
Yes.
And computers can't do it because there's no way of telling a computer to be spontaneous. And being spontaneous in that way is what you need to be an expert in if you want to be a commander of a military operation or a director of a large company. So very many important things are resting upon the fact that people can be spontaneous, but spontaneous in a way that means taking risks and taking
Yes.
responsibility for
Yeah.
important
Yeah. And
decisions.
that's a little explosion, a little bang of creativity there too.
Yeah.
They've
Yeah,
decided.
creativity is one of the things that creativity well understood. So I think that the reason why the one boy can say, shall we play chess, is because he knows a lot about the other boy and about what they've been doing recently. And similarly, the reason why a director of a company can make sensible decisions is because he's been working with that company or with that industry for a long time, and he knows a lot about what is right and good for that company. And so he can be creative because he knows what the world is like that he's being created in.
Yeah.
And Dostoevsky knew a lot about the world that he was writing about. And so he could be creative, which is to say something completely new, and yet know that his audience would take it. So he had to know a lot about his audience. And that's true of great creative people generally. So they break the rules, but in a way that still makes a lot of sense to the audiences that then experience those broken.
Yeah, and they introduce new content by reforming material that's already there.
Yeah.
No machine could do that just by cranking out options.
As you see when you look at what they produced.
Yes. I think something else that computers can't do or digital technology can't do is have an egocentrically centered point of view that requires conscious intentionality. And so knowing, so computers could plot positions, in a space, but they can't occupy those positions. Whereas we can. There we are.
I think one of the more interesting bits in our book is the discussion of the will, because that's the one thing that they have not given any kind of coherent description of on the side of the machine. It can't want anything. And
right. They don't have desires.
Yeah. And so they can't take over the universe, for instance.
Right.
They can't want to.
So how has the response been to your book? I mean, I haven't looked for reviews or...
so there have been quite a number of reviews, I think about 20, most of which were quite sympathetic, which it's not so good. It would be really good if they tried to show we were wrong. And then there have been lots of podcasts. So we've had, again, about 20 podcasts. Again, most of them were quite sympathetic. Even the ones where there was some hostility, they didn't really come through in the podcast. The podcast wasn't structured in a hostile way. But we haven't had any kind of response from real leaders in the field of AI. So they just regard us as dust. We're not important. So there is a man called Gary Marcus. I don't know if you've come across him.
I know the name. Yeah.
So he is the leader in the skeptical camp. He thinks that there probably will be AGI, but that it's going to take a lot longer than people suppose. We have the stronger view that AGI is impossible. Yeah. But Gary Marcus every other day comes up with some new scandal in OpenAI or in some other area of the AI gods. And he's really very good. And he says a lot of things which we say in our book after the book was published. But he also says other things. And so I haven't been on a panel with him, but it was an online panel. So we didn't actually shake hands. So it would be good if he would show where we're wrong, or if he would at least point to where we're right, or if someone else would of his caliber, or even someone who is an expert in AI would show where we're wrong. And we know that there are people like that because they wrote reviews of our book before it was finally accepted by a publisher. So we went through, it was the fourth publisher that published it. The first three publishers sent the book to AI experts. And
And
of
they were
course,
happy, of course.
they didn't like it. A priori would
Yeah.
put them out of a job. And so they wrote very negative reviews. And so it was a stroke of fate that we actually got the book published, given that there are so many AI people, and publishers would naturally send the book to one of those. But we came out all right in the end. And the most interesting thing is that it's sold well enough and it's used often enough in courses on AI and philosophy or AI and ethics. And so the publisher has already started with a second edition. So we've
Yes, that's right. You sent
corrected
me
the
the
proofs.
working draft. Yeah.
Yeah.
The second
Yeah.
edition. Did you are you in contact or interaction with Hinton with
No,
because he's critical of
yeah,
some aspects of the
but
program.
but on the other hand, he is also enthusiastic about the possibilities of AI.
Yes.
And so 5 years ago, he said the years may be wrong, but roughly, he said in 2 years' time, there will no longer be any of the medical community whose job is to analyze images. And still not a single person in medicine who analyzes images has been put out of a job. The AI is just not as powerful as Hinton assumed it would be.
Right.
And so radiologists, I think they're called.
Yeah.
So Hinton, I think, he's on our side because he's afraid.
Right.
He's afraid that the thing is very powerful and it will take over.
Right.
And so he wants to have lots of
Yes.
laws and things and
Right. But
standards.
we're afraid that it's not that it will take over, it's that people will believe it's taking over. Yeah. And that's the problem. That's the real problem.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And another thing that, of course, we can reasonably be afraid of is that humans will misuse it.
Yes.
And so there is room for AI ethics, but it's an ethics of the usual sort, which deals with humans.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And the kind of ethics I've been promoting is a broadly Kantian dignitarian ethics. And that's in the background of my criticism of the so-called AI as well, that our addiction to digital technology of certain kinds is undermining our capacity, or can undermine our capacity to use the capacities. I mean, our ability to use the capacities that we have and develop them. And so, like, an addiction to, say, substance D and a scanner darkly, people are just falling apart by refusing to write things and having computers do them, or spending all their time on their phones and not thinking through problems and so on, and then attaching that valorization to the larger AI project, instead of pushing back against it.
Yeah. So one of Gary Marcus's fears, let's say, is that AI is so powerful in a certain sense, so productive, let's say, that it's filling the internet with junk. Calls it enshittification. And he has examples of peer-reviewed papers which have obviously been written by AI and have not been checked by a human being, but they're in peer-reviewed journals.
Yeah.
And there is a 600 book sized series of travel books, 600 books, travel books, which all of which were written by AI and which are now for sale on the internet. And so they are the usual rather annoying, friendly, seemingly knowledgeable regurgitation of what other people have written in different forms. And it's sucked together and turned into a book, which they then sell. That's happening in all kinds of ways.
Right. Yeah, and it's making money, so that people have an incentive to promote it. Yeah.
And so it's not just that we're spending more time with electronic gadgets, it's that the electronic gadgets are becoming fuller and fuller with things that we really wouldn't want to experience in any normal world.
Yeah, I agree.
So what's next?
The next was Well, so this is with regard to the Kantian material. So, and this is also connected to your project of philosophy on rails, which
Oh
is
yeah, yeah,
a
good.
standardization of philosophical
Yeah,
terminology. And obviously, I would promote something like a Kantian terminology, refined, critically refined, and so on. I mean, and borrowing from analytic philosophy and so on. But it is definitely the case that Kantians do not agree about how to
yeah,
interpret Kant. They do not agree about how even to define the terms. And so, I spent years writing a couple of books about Kant just to get clear on those aspects of Kant and Kantian philosophy that I think still live, are defensible, and those that aren't, and then, promoting that. But it's just a drop,
yeah,
even less than it's a micro drop in the ocean of Kant studies. And so expecting even Kantians to get on board with a standardization of the terminology is probably foolish. On the other hand, I think it's also the case that post-Kantian philosophy is driven by, Kantian ideas, whether or for pro-Kantian or, neo-Kantian, orthodox Kantian or neo-Kantian or anti-Kantian. And so, as it happens, Kantian terminology has already slipped into the tradition, and just the distinction, say, between analytic and synthetic, a priori, a posteriori, these standard terms, not so much concepts and intuitions, but there are, notions that play those roles. So, for intuitions, direct reference or something like that.
yes,
Concepts, of course, terminology of concepts is, philosophy is pervaded
yes.
by. And so in a way, we've already got Kantian terminology. And so one proposal might be to refine it. But, again, I spent how many years trying to refine Kantian terminology, and it's made, well, little or no difference.
Yeah, so the way it started with ontology with me was that I became involved with a medical research group in Germany
Hmm.
who were interested in using ontologies, and I'll explain what that means in a minute, in
Mhm.
order to support the dealing with health data more successfully.
Mhm.
And I got an award from the German government to set up an institute on that topic. And almost the very first day when I started work in Germany, I became aware of something called the gene ontology.
Mhm.
And the gene ontology it's really, at that stage anyway, it was really just a collection of terms which are organized in a tree, a big tree with thousands of terms. And each term was given a rather sloppy logical definition. And it was an amazingly successful tool for people to describe genomic and proteomic information at a time when every country on earth was trying to build up repositories of information like that. And they were all doing it differently.
Mhm.
Gene ontology gave them a key to
A
do it
standard.
the same way, and it worked. We had to work on the definitions a lot, but it is in really good shape, and it's growing and growing in importance from year to year because there are more and more data and more experiments which yield more and still more data and so on.
Mhm.
And so I had the idea it came into my mind just before the COVID interlude. And so I scheduled a course which was called Philosophy on Rails. And my idea was that ontology could save philosophy in
Mhm.
just the same way that the gene ontology saved genomics and proteomics, namely by giving everybody a common vocabulary to argue about philosophical matters. And the idea would be that each term in this common vocabulary would have a definition. And now, of course, the question is, what vocabulary do you use for the
Mhm.
definition?
Yes.
And how do you resolve the fact that, given any definition in philosophy, you'll find seven philosophers, each of whom has their own competing definition.
Yes.
So I didn't actually manage to teach the course as I had intended because of
Mhm.
COVID.
Yeah.
But I don't think it would have gone very far, even if I had taught it,
Right.
because philosophy is in such a mess.
Yes. And you'd have to restructure graduate and undergraduate education too, so that students were introduced to the terminology
Yeah,
very early. Yeah.
yeah. You would
Mhm.
need a kind of Platonic kingdom where you
Mhm.
could
Yeah.
carry out this
Well, yes.
experiment.
Yeah. Radical social institutional
Yeah,
change, which would have to, it would also filter out through the whole
yeah,
system as well. People would have to be on board with the idea of, standard terminology and philosophers actually understanding each other.
yeah. But
Instead
now
of,
what we have at the moment is a lot of philosophy. I'm not sure about what percentage it is, but it's a lot. Is just people arguing about the meaning of a term.
mm,
And they, because they give different meanings to the same term, and they
mhm.
give different meanings to the terms that they use in their definitions and so on, all the way down. These arguments can go on forever. And
Yes.
that is not a way to run a discipline.
No, no. Yeah, they're really at cross purposes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I subscribe to Philosophy in Europe, a Philos L, and there's this feed of stuff every day, 20 or 30,
Oh, yes.
yeah, links of various kind of little descriptions of papers and so on. I bet 1 in 10 or 1 in 100 is really interesting. Everything else is just,
Yeah.
let's do a new workshop on, and then
Yeah.
some old term, and then, raising a couple of questions about different interpretations of the term. And then it just goes on and on and on, and people apply and they've got grants to do this. And
Yep.
yeah, it's hopeless, really.
Yep. So one of the ways of describing this, I like to think, is that we're in a period of scholasticism.
Yes.
That people are just multiplying problems because they can,
Yes.
and not because it leads to anything.
Yeah, and it gives them a career niche as well.
Yeah.
So they could crank that stuff out for the rest of their careers.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so to come back to where we started originally, so Buffalo might have this new department of applied ontology. How could you structure it or set it up so that it didn't collapse into, hyperscholastic niche?
Oh, so I think that we have found a way of solving that problem. So we will. There'll be two kinds of student. There'll be the online students, and we already have 23 online students,
Mhm.
most of whom work in Washington, some of whom are quite high-level Washington government officials.
Mhm.
And then we have a smaller cohort of people who are doing face-to-face philosophy degree
Mhm.
in the usual way. But gradually, though the number of people who are doing the traditional philosophy degree will be doing a new kind of degree in applied ontology. And so
Mhm.
we'll have everything will be hybrid. It will both be face-to-face and online.
Mhm.
And so one of the achievements that we made in the institute I founded in Germany in shaping up the gene ontology so that it would not have sloppy definitions, but would have good definitions, and using the same definitions in building other ontologies for things like disease and anatomy and so forth. We created what we call a top-level ontology, which is a philosophy an ontology with what look very much like philosophical terms, like object or process or quality or function or role or time, region, and so on. There are 35 terms in this ontology. It's called Basic Formal Ontology, BFO.
Mhm.
And it's been made an international standard. So our BFO is ISO-IEC 21838-2. So the International Standards Organization and the International Electrotechnical Commission have
Mhm.
deemed BFO to be an ISO standard. Now, the military particularly really likes ISO standard because they need to have something that everyone can be forced to follow.
Mhm.
And so BFO became a standard, not just on paper, but also in the biological world. It's now starting to be used in the same way in industry, and it's being used in this way, in a big way, in military and intelligence, and in the DHS, actually. That's probably our most successful area. Um, Now, because of our students all learn BFO, they can learn a bit about other approaches to ontology in contrast to BFO, but BFO is always in the center of what we do. And that has all kinds of benefits. It means the ontologies that people build are compatible. It means that they all have definitions which you have experts in treating so that we can check the definitions. It means that people get trained and they can go and work for other people and hire new ontologists. So our graduate students always immediately get jobs. Even our undergraduates now are getting quite well paid internships because they know how to build ontology.
Yes.
So we've solved that problem, I think. It's a bit like the standards people use for plugs and sockets. So everybody knows how to build a socket for a plug in America anyway. It's always the same. And the same should go for building ontologies. That's the idea.
Yeah. And so you can go forward and apply it. That's what you're saying.
Yeah. And then in principle, and we haven't made quite such headway in this area, but in principle, it could also be used as a starting point for doing interesting philosophy. That's a part of what I do is still philosophical. I guess the closer it is to applied ontology, the less seriously other philosophers take it. But some of what I do gets used by philosophers. One of the problems I face is that my philosophy friends think that what I do is not philosophy.
Because it's interdisciplinary.
And then BFO, because of its success, has enemies.
Of course.
And so they say, oh, BFO, it's just philosophy. No one can take BFO serious.
Yes. But that doesn't, I was going to say that doesn't solve the problem of careerist, publish or perish thinking, does it? Or is the idea that because these people are not being hired, particularly by philosophy departments, they're being, paid to do other kinds of jobs, not just crank articles.
Right. So what you're going to end up with is people trained in philosophy of a very special sort who then get jobs in other areas. So one of my colleagues here in Buffalo, who is much more interested than I am in ethics, but he's just as obsessed and just as crazy as I am about BFO and ontology. He has confronted people who attack philosophers for aiding the military because, well, there's a famous trolleyology set of problems. So there's an article which was published in a philosophy journal attacking people who write about trolleyology because they say it's helping the military to kill people.
Right.
And so we had an interview in the APA blog, just came out a few weeks ago. And he talks about that trolleyology problem. And he says that if you go into a military environment and start talking about ethics in the way that philosophers do, no one will listen. But if you go into a military environment as an engineer, basically, someone who can help them solve problems, and then try to make people understand some things about ethics, then they may very well take you seriously. And that's what he's been doing. So he was working with the military in Washington, and then he came to Buffalo because he didn't want to work for the government, not because working for the government is bad, although, well, one can talk about that, but because where he was, he had to do what they wanted him to do. And now he's in Buffalo and he can do what he wants to do.
Right. Yeah.
So what's next on the agenda?
Well, I think we've covered almost everything except what is genius, talent / proficiency. And I guess my answer to that has been, well, genius involves a kind of novelty which only a creature with free will and an imagination could produce, and that it introduces into subject matter a categorical difference between the input or the materials with which that creature is working and what's produced. But it's not a difference in the materials per se. It's a difference in the way that the materials are organized and reorganized, and also changed points of view on those materials. And it involves not only the individual creator, but also a larger social context that's sensitive to what it is and gets what it is that the genius or the original thinker, the original creator is doing.
So you're taking the words out of my mouth.
Okay, good.
So I think that I mentioned Dostoevsky earlier. Well, I think we can probably agree that he was a genius.
Yes.
He was able to write the novels that he wrote, even though they strain the limits of what a novel could be at that time.
Yes.
And have them be successful because he knew so much, not just about the kinds of people that he was writing about, but also of the people who were going to be reading what he was writing.
Right.
And you can't have that kind of deep, broad cultural knowledge. Even to use a phrase like that is to weaken the idea in a computer.
Yes.
You can't make a list of tenets of people and then use that list to determine how you could write something which would be which would open their eyes to something new and which they would accept as being of value. You can't do that in a machine.
Yes. Yeah. So there's the garbage in, garbage out problem, right? So, you just provide more and more stuff for the computer to rearrange, and that's all it can do. But it can't introduce this categorical difference between the materials and the restructure.
So we're in an early version of the manuscript of our book. I think I'm sure it's gone. I don't know. I can't remember deleting it. But we had a discussion of the Turing test. And the Turing test is very easy to pass, actually. You only need to convince 3 out of 5 people for 5 minutes that this is
yeah, and we're so gullible.
Yeah, and so what we suggested was that to have a real test for intelligence, you would have to have what we call the Stasi test. And the Stasi test would be open-ended. It would be at least 4 hours, but it may go on for longer, because that's how long Stasi interrogators take in order to do what they want to do, which is check that you're telling the truth about who you are.
Yeah.
Now, to tell the truth about who you are under those conditions, you need to have a life story. You need to have a life, basically. And the Stasi interrogator is tuned to people's lives. And so they ask questions about how they felt when their mother died, the computer would have to have a life story which would contain events like, well, my mother died when I was 3, or then we all moved to the Ukraine or something. And the Stasi interrogator is a human being, a very clever human being who knows about the emotions which are brought forth when you ask questions about those kinds of life events. To trick the to trick the interrogator, if you're a computer, under those conditions is practically impossible.
Yes.
Because only a human being can know what it's like to lose your mother at the age of 3 or whatever it might mean. And
and drawing on those
imitate that.
Yeah. Drawing on those capacities which require consciousness, in addition to the context of having lived that particular life.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah. Well, that was I think that was our list.
So we'll have to make a new list.
We'll have to. Go ahead and make a new list, or I'll contribute a list.
I think they have a lot to talk about still.
I think we do too. And so, so let's create a new list and then have another conversation.
Very good. All right. So we'll be in touch.
All right. Great to meet you, Barry.
Yeah.
And chat. Yep. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.